Just curious, what device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
They say you don't notice you're the outsider in your own family until you're standing in the middle of the living room, holding your breath, waiting for someone to acknowledge you, and all you hear is silence and the hum of the fridge. That fridge, that damned stainless steel monolith with its pristine whiteboard and perfectly aligned post-it notes. It wasn't even subtle. There it was, right in the center, the to-do list, written in Mom's flawless cursive like a grocery ad in a boutique magazine. Water the plants, feed Buster twice a day, rotate the couch cushions, and please remember to open the blinds every morning for the cat. And then, in smaller writing at the bottom, like a footnote to my entire existence, "Thanks, Rach," with a little heart, as if that made it sweet. As if that erased the fact that they packed their bags, took Tim, their precious baby boy, to a 5-star oceanfront resort in South Carolina, and left me behind like some unpaid maid whose thank you is a sticky note and the privilege of keeping the house from burning down. What really got me wasn't the task list or the fact that I'd canceled a rare long weekend with an old college friend just to be available in case anything goes wrong. What punched the air out of my lungs was the sudden realization that I wasn't on the emergency contacts list, magneted beside the list. There it was, Tim, cell, Carol's friend Marcia, home, neighbor Frank, text only, and then blank space. No Rachel, not even a scribble. My own parents had more confidence in Frank the weed-smoking neighbor, who once backed into their garage, than they did in me. I had to read the list 3 times before it sank in. It felt like seeing your name missing from a wedding guest list of a cousin you practically raised. And I know what you're thinking, Rachel, you're overreacting. It's just a note. But if you've ever been the one expected to show up but never invited, the one who gets the leftovers of affection and the full load of responsibility, then you know what I felt that moment. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even anger. It was hollow, like someone had scooped out the center of me, and I was just walking around with echoes inside. I stood there in their too quiet kitchen, staring at that fridge like it was a mirror reflecting back all the years I tried not to notice how different the rules were for Tim. I remembered birthdays, mine always a quiet dinner at home, maybe a sweater, while his were full-blown backyard circus disasters with rented tents and cake sculptures. I remembered how he crashed my used Corolla in high school and Dad paid for the repairs without blinking. But when I asked for help with my grad school loans, Mom just tilted her head and said, "Honey, you made your choices." And here's the twist. They didn't ask me. They told me. It wasn't a conversation. It was a text from Mom a week before. "We'll be out of town. Can you come stay at the house?" You know how the pets get when we're gone. That was it. Not even a "would you mind," just a statement, an assignment. Like I was part of the household staff, expected to clock in and be grateful for the opportunity to prove, once again, how dependable I was. The house felt colder than usual. Not temperature-wise, no, that thermostat was probably smart enough to auto-regulate, but emotionally, like it knew I wasn't meant to be there. I walked through the hallway toward the living room, the scent of lemon cleaner and that overpowering vanilla candle they always burned giving me a headache. The walls were lined with framed photos, mostly of Tim, graduations, vacations, his wedding, even that stupid charity 5K he ran shirtless and sunburned. I started counting. 1, 2, 3, 8 photos with Tim center stage. I found only one with all of us, from maybe 20 years ago. And even in that one, I was in the corner, half shadowed, like an afterthought. But then I saw it. The latest edition, placed right above the fireplace, a glossy print from their last family getaway. Tim and his wife grinning at some winery in Napa. Mom and Dad on either side. 4 people, smiling. I wasn't even told they'd gone. That was the moment it stopped feeling like a coincidence. It was the first time I understood deeply, like a punch to the ribs you don't see coming, that they didn't forget me. They erased me, intentionally or not. I'd become a background character in my own life story. So I did what anyone in my shoes might do. I smiled politely, I fed the cat, walked the dog, watered the succulents that were already half dead anyway. But something inside me clicked, like a switch I didn't know I had. Not rage, no, that would have been easy. It was a kind of cold clarity, the kind you get when the fog finally lifts and you realize no one's coming to save you. That if you want peace, you have to carve it out yourself, even if it means burning down the whole map of what you thought family was supposed to be. I slept that first night on the couch, not because there weren't beds, but because I wasn't sure I belonged in one. The guest room was locked anyway. Funny, right? They left me the house but locked the guest room. I laid there under a throw blanket that smelled like dryer sheets and dog hair, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow and lazy. Like time didn't matter, like none of it mattered. But I had 10 days. 10 days alone in the house I grew up in. 10 days to think. 10 days to notice every crooked photo frame and every locked drawer. 10 days to decide what kind of woman I really wanted to be. And by the time the lights turned off that first night, I already knew I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to disappear so thoroughly, so silently, that when they walked back through that door, they'd have no idea what had shifted. But they would feel it. They would feel the space I used to fill, and it would haunt them. The second morning in that house hit differently, not because anything extraordinary happened, not because the pets misbehaved or I discovered some awful secret, but because as I sat at the kitchen island with a cup of lukewarm coffee and a piece of dry toast I found in the back of the bread drawer, the silence had started to feel not just empty, but intentional, as if the walls were somehow complicit in the story of my erasure, as if they too had agreed to forget I ever mattered, and were now staring me down with passive, freshly painted hostility. It wasn't the first time I had stayed there alone. Over the years, I had popped in to help with this or that, to walk the dog while they were at Tim's kids' soccer games, to collect packages, to water plants, but this was the first time I realized how little space in that house was actually meant for me. You'd think a family home, the house where you spent your teenage years, the house where you cried on the staircase after your first heartbreak, where you memorized the creak in the third stair from the top and the exact squeak of the hallway vent, would hold at least some hint of your presence, even after all this time. But as I wandered through each room, opening cabinets and drawers, not out of nosiness, but out of muscle memory, looking for a spoon or a napkin, or just something familiar, it occurred to me how methodically I had been pushed out. There were no photos of me after the age of 18, no trace of my college years, no framed graduation, no family trip to my new city when I landed my first job, nothing from the time I got promoted, nothing from the time I was laid off and didn't even get a phone call. All those chapters of my life, like pages ripped from a book and tossed into the fire, not because they were too painful, but because they simply didn't fit the narrative. I eventually drifted to the guest room, thinking maybe I could make myself more comfortable, that if I was going to stay for 10 days, I at least deserved a proper bed. But when I turned the knob, it didn't budge. Locked. The room was locked. My parents had locked the guest room in their own home before leaving me to stay there, like I might steal something, like I wasn't trustworthy, like I hadn't been the one who stayed up late with Mom when she had her back surgery, or drove Dad to his eye appointments when Tim was too busy. I stood there for several minutes, my hands still on the doorknob, as if by sheer persistence I could will it open, but it didn't give, and I didn't knock. There was no one to knock for. I returned to the living room and collapsed onto the couch, my body curling not from exhaustion, but from that aching, quiet grief that only comes when you finally, truly understand your place in the world and realize it's nowhere near where you thought it was. It was then, trying to distract myself, that I reached for the drawer beneath the television stand, the one Mom always kept neat with coasters and candles and old remote controls that didn't seem to belong to anything anymore. It stuck slightly, probably from swelling in the humidity, but after a gentle tug, it slid open and tucked between a stack of ancient holiday cards and a remote with dead batteries, I saw it. An envelope. It was yellowed at the edges, sealed but dusty, and across the front, in my own handwriting, it said, "For Mom and Dad." I knew what it was before I even touched it, because I remembered writing it. I was 17, fresh off a particularly vicious argument where I had begged to go to a music camp I'd been accepted to with a partial scholarship, and they told me no, said it was too far, too expensive, and not practical. Tim had just come back from a 3-week basketball clinic across the country that they'd paid for in full, even sent him with new shoes and spending money. I had written that letter in tears, not out of anger but out of desperation, trying to explain how small I felt, how invisible, how I just needed them to see me for once. And they had never opened it. I held the envelope in my hand, heart pounding in that weird, dull way that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with humiliation you thought you'd buried. I didn't cry, I didn't yell. I just sat there, staring at the sealed flap, realizing they'd kept it all these years, but never once thought to read it. They knew it was there. They had moved houses 3 times since I wrote that letter, and each time they'd packed and unpacked this drawer. Someone had chosen to keep it, and someone had also chosen to leave it sealed. I put the envelope back, precisely where I found it, and closed the drawer gently, like I was putting a memory to bed. I didn't want them to know I saw it. I didn't want to give them that satisfaction, that opening for another lecture about how I overthink everything and never let things go. But that letter, sealed and untouched, told me everything I needed to know. It confirmed that my absence had never been accidental. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been avoided. That night, I didn't bother folding out the sofa bed. I lay across the cushions, fully dressed, staring at the darkened ceiling, thinking not just about the letter, but about the 100 other little things I'd brushed off over the years. Like how I was always the one expected to compromise, to bend, to stay quiet for the sake of peace. Like how every time Tim screwed up, I was the one expected to help fix it. Like how Mom always said, "Well, you're the strong one, Rachel," as if strength was some kind of punishment. And somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, as the cat curled up near my feet and the dog let out one long sigh from the corner, I knew I wasn't going to spend the next 8 days doing nothing. I wasn't going to wait for them to come back and smile and act like everything was fine. No, I was going to change something. Something small at first, something quiet, like the way you rearrange your room before moving out. I wasn't going to scream or beg or explain anymore. I was going to erase myself, not from life, but from their version of it. And when they came home, they would know something had shifted, but they'd never be able to say when it started, only that it was too late to stop it. There's something almost sacred about the silence of a house that no longer pretends to love you, because once you stop expecting warmth from it, once you stop fooling yourself that the walls are anything more than drywall in memory, it becomes something else entirely, something you can observe without pain, something you can shape with your own hands. And over the 72 hours that followed, that's exactly what I began to do, quietly, deliberately, and with a kind of icy calm I didn't even know I possessed. A calm born not from peace, but from the acceptance that I was, and always had been, disposable. I didn't do anything dramatic at first. That would have made me look bitter, unstable, and that wasn't the point. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone in the way they'd expect or could defend against. Instead, I started with the photos. Not the big ones, not the ones that screamed family, but the little ones. The background clutter that no one looks at unless something is missing. There was a tiny framed photo of Tim on his first day of high school, tucked in beside a lamp in the hallway. I turned it around. A picture of Mom at a charity brunch with the words, "Proud of my boy," scrawled in silver marker across the bottom. I slipped it from its frame and placed it face down in the drawer. These weren't acts of destruction, just removal, like an editor cutting unnecessary words from a story that was bloated with self-congratulation. By the second day, I moved on to the mail. Nothing drastic, just sorting. Tim still received a ton of it at their house despite having a perfectly good mansion across town with his wife and 2 kids. So I started a pile. Not junk mail, not credit card offers, but the stuff that actually mattered. Bank statements, birthday cards, a jury duty notice addressed to him from 2 weeks ago. I didn't hide it. I just neatly packed it into a manila envelope, sealed it, and placed it in the back of their office cabinet beneath old tax forms from a decade ago. It wasn't sabotage, it was cleanup. Spring cleaning, if you want to be poetic about it. It's strange how quickly you begin to feel like a ghost when you start behaving like one. I found myself walking softer, speaking less, even to the dog, who had stopped following me from room to room and now just watched with that confused, slightly offended look dogs give when the energy of the room has shifted, but they can't quite understand why. I began to catalog the inconsistencies, not as a way to dwell on the past, but as data, as proof. The guest room being locked was just the start. There was also the fact that Tim had his own key on a custom lanyard, while mine was one of those plastic copies you make for babysitters. My name wasn't in their address book, not the printed one by the phone or the digital one in Mom's iPad contacts. Their will, which I knew existed because Tim once bragged about being the executor, wasn't anywhere in sight. And when I searched the file cabinet for it, not out of greed but curiosity, I found only a neatly labeled folder with estate planning on it, empty. By the third day, I began the erasure, not of them, but of me. Not with fire or scissors or graffiti, but with gentle surgical precision. I started with the old family albums stored in the cabinet beneath the TiVo, thick leather-bound volumes that hadn't been touched in years, their pages slightly yellowed, their plastic sleeves peeling at the corners. I didn't remove photos. I simply peeled back the plastic, took an eraser, and gently rubbed out my name from the captions. Summer '92, Tim and Rach at the lake became Tim at the lake. Christmas Eve, Rach's cookies became holiday treats. It took time. It took care. It took me hours to work through just 2 albums, and by the end, my fingerprints were smudged with graphite and guilt. But not regret. I wasn't doing it to punish them, at least not in the way they would think. I was doing it because I needed to see what the world would look like without me in it, what their lives looked like, what the photos said, what the notes on the fridge meant when my name was never spoken. I was experimenting with my own absence, and it was horrifying how little difference it made. I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I didn't leave accusatory notes or dramatic messages. I fed the pets, I kept the lights on at night, I made sure the thermostat was comfortable, I made tea in the morning and even washed the sheets on the 6th day just to make sure there was nothing to complain about. I was, by all external accounts, the perfect daughter, the reliable one, the one who always showed up and never asked for anything. But inside, I was vanishing, on purpose, in plain sight. At one point, around dusk on the 3rd night, I sat on the back patio with a glass of wine I found in the cabinet, the cheap kind they only opened when guests were over, and stared out at the fence line, at the little garden gnome Tim painted as a child that still sat, cracked and leaning, by the hydrangeas. I thought about what would happen if I just got in my car and drove away. Didn't leave a note, didn't return the key, just disappeared from their lives like I had never been real to begin with. And I realized they wouldn't call the police, they wouldn't panic, they'd assume I got tired, that I overreacted again, that I had one of my moods. Maybe they'd send a text a week later, something vague and polite. Hope all is well, thanks again for taking care of things. And then they'd move on, comfortably unaware that the woman they thought they knew had finally decided she was done playing the role they'd written for her. So I stayed. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to finish what I started. Erasing yourself isn't as simple as walking away. It's a process, a ritual, and I wasn't finished yet. Not until they could walk into their perfect little home, look around, and feel like something wasn't quite right, but never be able to put their finger on it. Not until the silence felt like a scream. When they came back, tan, bloated with luxury buffet food, and buzzing with that smug, self-satisfied glow that only comes from 10 days of having absolutely no responsibilities and 0 interruptions. It was as though they expected to walk into the same version of their home they had left behind, polished and obedient, with the scent of lemon cleaner in the air and the cat purring on the windowsill like a prop in a family-friendly sitcom. And I made sure they got exactly that on the surface. The house was immaculate. The mail was neatly stacked on the counter. Buster, the dog, had been walked and fed and even brushed so well that Mom paused to pet him with a raised eyebrow as if confused by how healthy he looked. The trash was emptied, the dishwasher was clean and cracked open to air dry. The thermostat was set to their exact preferred temperature. There was no chaos, no disaster, no trace of anger. And yet, as they moved from room to room with bags in their hands and that vacation haze in their eyes, I watched their expressions shift, ever so slightly, not with fear or suspicion, but with that uneasy, itching discomfort that you can't quite name. Like when a familiar song plays in a different key, or the clock on the wall is 5 minutes fast, and you're not sure why you feel so unsettled. They didn't say anything at first. That's the beauty of subtlety. It doesn't demand acknowledgement. It burrows, it gnaws. They passed the wall of family photos without a word, even though I had gone through every single frame with surgical precision, removing my image from each one in a way so seamless it could almost be blamed on fading or faulty printing. In the beach photo from that Myrtle Beach trip when I was 23, where we'd all been crammed onto the sand in matching shirts, I had edited myself out digitally and reprinted it, placing the new version in the same dollar store frame. In another shot from Christmas morning, Mom in a red robe, Dad with coffee, Tim holding up a gift, I had simply trimmed the edge of the photo so that my pajama-clad form was gone, just out of view. I had even left the frame tilted slightly to the left, just like it always had been, so that nothing seemed touched. But something was missing, and they knew it. They didn't speak of it during dinner, which we shared awkwardly that first evening back. Not because I wanted to, but because Mom insisted, in that brittle, passive way she always did when she was trying to assert closeness where none existed. She reheated lasagna from the freezer, poured me a glass of wine, and began narrating the highlights of their vacation as if I were a neighbor watching a slideshow instead of their daughter, who had been entrusted to guard their house while they guzzled mimosas by the ocean. I nodded, smiled at the appropriate places, even asked questions like a good daughter would, but inside I was screaming not out of rage, but out of the strange, suffocating stillness of being unseen even when sitting directly across from them. It wasn't until the next morning that Tim noticed. He had come by to pick up a package and drop off some clothes he'd left in the laundry room, yes, because somehow, even now, his belongings still lived in their house like sacred artifacts. And as he walked through the hall, sipping his overpriced espresso from a travel mug and tapping away on his phone, he stopped suddenly and looked up at the fireplace. I was in the kitchen, pretending not to watch, but I saw it happen. The moment when he tilted his head just enough to notice that something wasn't quite right with the family portrait hanging above the mantel. It was from 5 years ago, one of those, we hired a professional photographer to meet us at the park and pretend we're not dysfunctional shoots. And in the original version, I'd been standing to the far left, awkwardly tucked between a tree and Tim's wife. Now, it was just them. The same tree, the same sunlight, the same poses, but I was gone. He didn't say anything. He just stared for a moment longer than necessary, blinked, and then turned away like maybe he was imagining it. Or maybe the memory was fuzzy, or maybe it just wasn't worth asking. But the seed had been planted. I knew then that the erasure wasn't just working, it was growing. That evening, I left them something, not out of pettiness, not as a threat, but as a final gesture. A soft punctuation mark at the end of a sentence they'd never read properly. It was a flash drive, nothing fancy, tucked inside a small envelope that I placed in the center of the dining table. No note, no explanation, just the drive, waiting. And on it, a collection of scanned family photos, the same ones that had lined the hallway and filled the albums for decades. But with one small change. I wasn't in any of them. Every photo had been carefully edited, some digitally, others physically, and rescanned. In some, I had blurred my figure. In others, I had simply been removed. But every single one of them was the same in one critical way. They told the story of a family without a daughter. Later that night, as I lay on the couch pretending to sleep, I heard the soft sound of the television clicking off, followed by hushed voices. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew what they were feeling. confusion first, then denial, then a slow creeping fear that perhaps something had shifted while they weren't paying attention, something subtle but irreversible, something that could not be undone with a phone call or a text or another lasagna dinner. They didn't confront me. They didn't scream or accuse or ask me why. That would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would have meant admitting they noticed the void I had created. Instead, they tiptoed around it, around me, like I was a crack in the foundation they hoped wouldn't spread. But it was too late. The silence had spoken, and it would only get louder from here. There's something inherently violent about being ignored, not in the theatrical sense where someone storms out or slams a door, but in the quiet, chronic erosion of being treated like background noise in a place where you were supposed to be a central character. And as I sat there that final morning in the home that had once pretended to be mine, sipping cold coffee while the early sun sliced through the blinds in harsh surgical stripes, I realized that I no longer felt hurt or even angry. I felt hollowed out and weightless, like something essential had finally fallen away. And in its absence, there was only space, quiet, and a kind of terrifying clarity that comes when there is nothing left to misunderstand. The house had shifted around me in those final hours, not physically, of course, but atmospherically, as if the very air inside it had become heavier with unspoken recognition. The energy had changed, subtly, unmistakably, like a scent lingering after a storm, or the ringing in your ears after someone screams but the room itself stays still. They knew something had happened. They felt it on their skin like static, but they couldn't articulate it without giving power to it. So instead, they moved through their routines like actors afraid of breaking character. My mother fluffed pillows with mechanical precision. My father mumbled through the news, with his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. And Tim, who used to burst through the front door with noisy confidence and the entitlement of someone who had always been celebrated, now walked softer, looked over his shoulder, and didn't meet my eyes when he said goodbye. They didn't ask me about the photos, they didn't mention the flash drive, they didn't confront me about the silence, and I didn't offer them anything to soothe their growing unease. That was the contract we'd always operated under. Don't ask, don't explain, don't disrupt the fiction that everything was fine, and everyone is happy in their designated role. But something had fractured in that fiction. Something that couldn't be mended with casseroles or passive-aggressive smiles. And though no one said it aloud, I could feel the weight of their questions pressing against the walls of the house like trapped breath. When I packed my bag, a modest overnight duffel with a few changes of clothes, my laptop, a notebook filled with sketches and lists, and one half-burned-out pen, I didn't do it with urgency or dramatic flair. There were no suitcases slamming, no final glances over my shoulder. I folded my clothes with care, zipped the bag, and left the sheets on the couch neatly draped, just as I had found them. I walked into the kitchen and ran the dishwasher, even though it only had 3 glasses in it. Then I wiped down the counters, fed the dog one last time, and left the back door slightly ajar so the cat could come and go without fuss. It wasn't about revenge anymore, not really. It was about exit. It was about letting go of the need to be seen by people who had always chosen not to look. I left no note, no dramatic goodbye, only one last offering. A single printed photograph that I placed on the mantel in a plain wooden frame, not flashy or sentimental, just simple and undeniable. It was a photo of the living room taken that morning, but this time I had placed myself at the center of the couch, facing the camera directly, smiling, not the kind of performative, strained smile that mothers beg for in holiday cards, but a small, quiet smile, the kind that says, I know exactly who I am, and I no longer need your permission to exist. They would find it eventually, maybe later that day, or maybe not for weeks, and when they did, they would be forced to look, truly look, at a version of me they didn't recognize. A woman who had stepped out of the margins and into the center of the frame, unapologetically, irrevocably. And they would feel it, not the photo itself, but the absence it marked, the space I had claimed, The silence I had weaponized, not with cruelty, but with finality. In the weeks that followed, I didn't hear from them, not really. There were a few attempts, one generic email from Mom with the subject line, "Hope you're well," and a short text from Tim that just said, "Everything okay?" followed by an emoji I didn't bother interpreting. I left them unread. I didn't block them. I just let them exist in the purgatory of unacknowledged outreach, because that was the only language they had ever understood: absence, distance, avoidance. I moved into a small cabin 3 states away, not because I was running, but because I wanted to live somewhere where the walls didn't whisper old stories at me every night, where the floors didn't remember the weight of childhood tears or the echo of conversations that always ended with, "Don't be so dramatic." The cabin was modest, quiet, surrounded by trees, and the kind of stillness that doesn't demand explanation. I didn't decorate it much, but I hung one thing on the wall: a large blank canvas. No colors, no shapes, just white. Space, possibility. Sometimes I think about calling them. Not to reconnect, but just to see if they'd pick up, to hear their voices falter as they scrambled to pretend nothing had changed. But I don't, because I know what they'd say. They'd try to pull me back into the narrative where I'm the reliable one, the good daughter, the emotional sponge. And I'm done being that version of myself. I've buried her. What I left behind wasn't just a message, it was a mirror. And they could either look into it and see what they had ignored for decades, or they could turn away and go on living inside their curated version of reality. Either way, it was no longer my problem. And maybe that's the real revenge. Not the photos, not the edits, not the silence, but the absolute certainty that I no longer needed anything from them. Not their love, not their recognition, not their approval, just space, and the freedom to fill it however I damn well please.